Welcome to the very first show of Power Talks with Santosh Saab. On this talk show, we will feature leaders, dignitaries, celebrities, and changemakers from around the world. The topics that we will cover will be on global issues, politics, diplomacy, international relations, and of course, development and hope and change. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Robert Piper, who is the UN Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for Nepal. United Nations has become inevitable in today's world. It's difficult to imagine a world without the presence of the UN. Directly or indirectly, United Nations has contributed to the development and peace process throughout the world in small ways or big ways. Yes, of course, there are problems everywhere at any given time, but UN works like a common platform for global citizens to come together and seek a solution. In early 2009, we saw a huge crisis that we had never imagined of. That is the global economic crisis. Interestingly, the richer countries, the developed countries, seem to be more affected by this crisis than the developing countries. Your Excellency, Nepal, which is a developing country, should we worry too much about this recent crisis of economy?
Oh, I think we all have to be very worried. I think that it's a very tough year ahead.
Right.
The projections from most of the experts is that we can't really look forward to beginnings of a recovery until the second half of 2010. Most of the projections are for the world economy to either stagnate or grow very slightly. And Nepal can't escape. There is two waves of this. The first wave is very much affecting the banking sector.
Right.
And it's true, Nepal's banking sector is a little bit more sheltered, as they describe themselves, from the global banking system. But the second wave is going to hit the real economy, and that's going to, of course, it's going to hurt Nepal. We're not sure yet what it's going to look like. It may hit remittances. It most likely will hit remittances, which are almost a quarter of the GDP, so that's going to be severe. It may hit tourism. It may hit some of the export markets. So we will have to wait and see, but certainly it may also hit, I should say, aid flows. It's a tough environment to raise resources for development. So we'll have to wait and see what's in store for us. But it's a time for some very sobering thinking about what's ahead.
When you look at Millennium Development Goal, Nepal was very hopeful with the MDG that UN had introduced a few years back. What are the shortcomings? Because the donor countries and the big corporates are quite affected by the economic crisis. So where will we see problems with Nepal's development due to the MDG lacking funds in the future?
Well, I guess the possibilities are in two levels. One, of course, is, and the most important, let's make no mistake, the engine of any economy is not aid, it's the private sector, it's employment. So the hardest hit to any progress on the MDGs is going to be in terms of employment, in terms of export markets, in terms of reduced tourist arrivals. That's going to hit the MDGs hardest in Nepal if that scenario takes place. At a second level, indeed, globally, Nepal is one of those countries that has not a dependency, but it has a lot of aid flows coming to Nepal, $600 to $700 million a year. It remains to be seen whether globally aid flows start to reduce. Certainly we're seeing in many of the key donor countries for Nepal, countries like the US or UK, much harder discussions in Parliament about protecting their government's aid commitments. The President of the World Bank has tried to maintain an argument that with all these governments making huge stabilization investments into their banking sector, that 0.7% of these programs should also be set aside to protect development assets, to protect development investment.
So we'll see some effects with other donor agencies' aid as well, not just the UN, MDG?
We're not seeing any yet, but it's a tough environment. We'll have to just look at this, watch it very carefully. It may well catch up with the aid flows, indeed.
When we think of United Nations, in a time of conflict, in times of war within the country or with neighbors, the general perception is that UN is always there ready with its troop or with its peacekeepers, and it's going to intervene right away. But normally, whenever there's a conflict, we don't see an immediate intervention of the UN. For example, in July 2006, there was a war between Israel and Lebanon. It took 3 weeks for the UN to get to a decision with the Israel and Lebanon war. Who makes these decisions, and why is there such a big lag when such an emergency arises?
Well, at the end of the day, the UN is only as good as its member states want it to be. And a decision like sending in tens of thousands of peacekeepers is a decision that can only be made by the Security Council, and is a very, very high-risk decision. And often, obviously, the result of very complicated political negotiations. The UN will only move when it comes to security and peace, when its Security Council has instructed it to do so. That's only one part of the UN. You used the example of Lebanon in 2006. In that 4-week period of the war, the UN was fully deployed in Lebanon. It was protecting humanitarian aid convoys. It was getting assistance to displaced people in the middle of the war, in fact. So one part of the UN, a large part of the UN, was deployed literally overnight. But it's quite true, the peacekeepers only showed up about actually a month after the ceasefire, actually 3 months, I'm sorry, after the ceasefire. But within 3 months, there were about 14,000 peacekeepers on the ground in Lebanon. That's not a bad record. Unfortunately, if you look at places like Darfur or the Congo, the delay is much, much greater. So it's a factor, it's a function of, one, how quickly the Security Council reaches a decision, and then two, when we're talking about peacekeepers, how quickly member states are able to provide actual soldiers to do the work. Nepal, in fact, sent a battalion to Lebanon and was a part of the very early response.
Recently, the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon visited Nepal, and you obviously played a very important role in that. How much can we expect? How much can Nepal expect out of this trip?
Well, I think the Secretary General came to really underline his commitment to Nepal, his interest in the peace process, his support to the political mission. It was important for him to verify as well what was going on the ground so that he could report back to the Security Council. I think we've already seen a payoff in the sense that the Security Council discussion on the extension of UNMIN, which took place only a couple of weeks ago, was a very positive one. I think, of course, there's a lot of anxieties about some of the outstanding issues that need to take place in the peace process. But on the other hand, member states, I think, were reassured that the UN was properly engaged, was being led well, and the Secretary General could obviously speak firsthand about what he saw. It was a chance for him, of course, to interact with the political leaders and the CA members as well, to underscore his support, and of course to voice some of the warnings for the process ahead, because we're not there yet, obviously.
You've been in Nepal for 1 year, and you'll have 4 more years to go in the country. We'll talk more about your works, your life, after a short break. We'll see you after a short break. Stay with us.